welcome, folksy folks. Welcome to Fabric of Folklore podcast. I'm your hostess, Vanessa Y. Rogers, and this is the podcast where we unravel the mysteries of folklore. This podcast is about exploring our past, our present, and our future. Folklore is culture, it's identity, it's the expression of who we are as a people. Our folk tales, mythologies, rituals, and traditions all help to paint the picture of what we hold dear and what we value as a group. Beauty and the Beast, for instance, is a fairy tale that most people are familiar with, but it was actually based off of a true person, someone who suffered from a genetic condition that caused excessive hair growth. And there were lots of different messages imparted in the fairy tale itself, one of which is that beauty is within, not just without, but another was a reflection on society at large's difficulty accepting people who look different than what we expect. And on Fabric of Folklore, we want to ask these deeper questions, these deeper level questions. And in doing so, we have a better understanding of our changing values and those of our cultures and other cultures. When we explore these underlying messages, we build understanding and empathy, which turns us into better human beings. So if that is a podcast that you want to continue to listen to, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get our notification every week when our podcast drops, whether that's on YouTube if you're watching, or if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform like Spotify or Apple. Make sure you're subscribing. And if you're a longtime listener, consider giving us a review. That's so helpful so that other new listeners can find us. And we have a fantastic, fun show today, one that I'm really excited about because it's the first guest who teaches at my alma mater, University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Rachel Valentina Gonzalez is an assistant professor of Mexican American and Latino studies at the University of Austin at Texas, University of Texas at Austin. She is the co-editor of Race and Cultural Practice in Popular Culture and author of Quinceañera Style, Social Belonging, and Latinx Consumer Identities. It was a winner of 2 awards in 2020, the Emily Toth Best Book in Women's Studies and the Popular Culture, and the Eli Cangas Miranda Prize in Women's Studies in Folklore. We're going to be talking about her book today, which is a dynamic study of social negotiation and consumerism in the coming of age quinceañera celebration and the impact of normalizing spectacles of luxury. So thanks so much, Rachel, for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And in case anyone's wondering, I love consumerism. So this is not a negative, but it's just thinking about the cultural phenomenon of buying.
Great footnote. So in the beginning of your book, you tell us really beautiful story of one of your first experiences with the quinceañera when you were a little girl at your god sister's quinceañera celebration. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah. So one of the big things with writing about quinceañeras and talking to people planning quinceañeras about quinceañeras was that I was consistently being asked into their story by sharing my story. And so sort of on repeat, I realized, well, I never had a quinceañera. Quinceañera was not something that my parents were interested in hosting. It was very antithetical in many ways, the consumerism of it, but also the sort of feminine spectacle. My father wasn't interested in me being a public female in any kind of way. I grew up in the 90s in the San Francisco Bay Area in Oakland. And so there was just a lot of conservative thoughts about being safe, being inside, definitely not sort of being out there. So my god sister Amelia, who's lovely, who's spent most of her life on the East Coast, but was back and forth to the Bay Area where her mom lived. She had her quinceañera at 16. So she was having a quince in this hybrid way, which was, half of her friends were mostly, American. So they understood 16 as a special number. And then her family, her mother is Puerto Rican. And so this mix of the quince and the 15th. And so she had a big old quince, but for her 16th birthday. And growing up, that was really the only quince I ever participated in. So when I was interviewing young women, there was a lot of me understanding my story in reference to how they were telling their story, if only because they were asking me questions. So my sort of closest memory to being in this quinceañera was being a little girl and repurposing my first communion dress, which I remember very distinctly. And I remember Amelia's dress. Like that was the biggest thing that I remember because it was beautiful. It was big and it was satin. And you mentioned Beauty and the Beast. That's like my favorite Disney. That's my favorite story. But her dress, Amelia's dress, was sort of that sweetheart cut, and it was off the shoulder. It looked a lot like the cut of Belle's gold dress in the film, in the cartoon, the Disney movie. And so I just remember that very distinctly, this idea that she wasn't in pink, she was in peach. And I just thought it was so pretty. So I remember very distinctly those colors and that experience. And then I remember later, um, growing up in our house where my mother, they had in Spanish it's called a vitrina, but like a curio cabinet, like where they kept
Yep.
things, nice things that you only use seasonally. And there was always a little plastic high heel that was filled with a little gauzy bag that had, I believe it was potpourri in it that had a little peach colored ribbon, and that ribbon is called a capia. And the capia has like a stamped name and date on it. So it said Emilia's Quinceañera in little gold writing on one side of the ribbon. On the other side, it had the date. And so
Oh.
I never really realized till later that the keepsake, this memory object, right? I always remember it being there and having it, and sometimes I even forgot the event. It's like, oh yeah, we had that. That was something we participated in. And so when I was working on this project and developing, trying to understand how young women were communicating about the tradition itself, it really put me in a place to have to remember my own connections and even remind myself that you do have connections. It's just they aren't the same as others, but um, you remember these moments. And so that was a really interesting sort of like a memory experience for me to go back and be thinking about, oh yeah, I have my quince memory in my own way. It doesn't match other people's. I don't have I turned 15 and this magic happened, or the dress happened, or tragedy happened, whatever the theme was. But I did have this memory of standing with my god sister and being part of it, and even remembering how being included in it was so meaningful, even though I was terrified as a very shy child. So the idea of having to walk up an aisle kind of by myself, right? With people looking at me, even if it wasn't my event, that was that spotlight enough. I remember like, oh, I don't want to do it. Please don't make me do it. But even now in retrospect, thinking how important it was that both my brother and I were there, really reinforces, these community family dynamics that, in many ways, like, oh, if I had understood that then the way I understand it now, I feel like I would probably still be close to Amelia, right? But since our lives have since split. Yeah. So
So
that's a little bit of the story.
were you sad when you didn't have your own quinceañera, or did you have a sweet 16, or did you just not?
I was definitely a more quiet, nervous teenager. I did not have a quince. I did not want to have a quince. Like I was definitely not that wasn't sort of my style in general, 15 or 16. My family wasn't also very I grew up in a traditional Mexican American household. There wasn't a lot of like going to friends' house, doing a lot of things. You mostly stayed with your family, you stayed home. So there wasn't, to me, it just was not, it wasn't an appealing option, but it also wasn't really an option. So it wasn't necessarily something that was cultivated in my house. But I had friends who were having quinces, and it was a bit, you heard people planning or talking about it, but people that I was friendly with, but not necessarily people that like I wasn't going to be part of their celebration. The school I went to, the high school I went to, I went to a Catholic school, went to private school, and actually demographically, Latinos were a pretty small number. So it wasn't necessarily like I had a ton of Latino friends. Actually, my friends were mostly Asian American. So sort of a different kind of cultural community. Even though you can check boxes for like, oh, I'm Mexican American, or this is where I'm from. I didn't necessarily grow up with that being so close to particularly my adolescent years, that it was even something that crossed my mind. Yeah.
And you mentioned the big dresses, and they're larger than life. They take center stage. It's not even, the equivalent of a wedding dress. They're big. Have they always been like that?
No, not at all. And even now, it's like we think about like the biggest dresses or the most spectacular styles and things. Marketing is huge. Especially targeted segmented marketing, right? So the Latino quinceañera industry is booming and growing and has been for decades. Before, so my dissertation before the book really was about the dresses and the transformation of dress and dress style. And some of it is really basic, right? The idea that as dress shapes and styles leave, let's say, home dressmakers or community dressmakers and just become part of a more general consumer public, right? They're getting influenced by other forms of fashion, other forms of culture. And they're also just growing in size and spectacularity because all of a sudden you have this kind of competition for like, what do you want? And then people sort of one-upping. Well, if I want it this big, you'll have it this big, or even with the idea of color variability. So I spent a lot of time thinking about like, what did they used to look like? What do they look like now? Knowing that there's a lot of flux and flow, but it was really the quinces. When people, quote unquote, when people within Latino communities think of like a traditional quinceañera dress, they're really picturing something that is, I always want to say demure, but something that is white or pink, something that is very much more of what's understood to be sort of a classy señorita, like a good young girl, right? Who is probably, we're thinking in line with sort of the issue of virginity, someone being tied to sort of a good family, a religious community. That's the culture that has been built up around it. So you often had young women in more modest dresses or dresses that were full length, that had, a coverage of the shoulders or décolleté. Again, we're thinking about a very particular kind of modesty, right? And that modesty also translated into color, right? So, if you were a young girl, you wore pink or white, you weren't wearing black or red. And that was something that was maintained by families, right? Oh, your mother was going to help your grandmother make your dress, or your aunt. But as people, as communities, Latino communities in the U.S. were, growing and moving. So if you didn't live in somewhere like San Antonio or you didn't live in L.A., right? The idea that all of a sudden, if your family moves, you don't have those same traditional models around you, and you also don't have the same traditional labor force. So if your aunt made everybody's quince and your family moved to Milwaukee, you're going to have to find someone else. And then you're sort of translating, well, what do you want? Well, what do you have? And so some of the earliest quince dresses were really coming from Cuban Americans or new Cuban Americans, Cuban exiles who were in South Florida and who wanted to continue quince traditions, but their resources locally were wedding shops. And so what you had were sort of these elaborate wedding dresses that were being modified, right? You had trains being cut off, you had veils being removed, maybe you added gloves, right? There was something about this that was like, okay, we'll just transplant it. But as these sort of traditions grew, and so for me, what's really interesting is thinking about the dress changing is really thinking about cultural values shifting. Maybe not solidifying in any one way, but people sort of testing things out. So as we see sort of the quince leaving, let's say it isn't just the church community and a family community and cousins and extended family. Now you're talking about all my school friends and like all the people that my dad knows, or whether that's, culturally, like, co-occurring cultural communities or mixed communities, right? All of a sudden there's just new influences. And so as the dresses entered a larger marketplace, right? All of a sudden, okay, white is nice, pink is nice, but now people are saying, well, my favorite color is blue, or my favorite color is yellow, or I don't want to look like my sister. All these other factors have said, okay, now that we're dealing with a marketplace that isn't just like, well, your grandmother's going to gift you something and that's what you get. It's, we're going to go to a shop and we're going to start looking at what's at this shop. Right. And then you have a mix of, well, these are the wedding collections, but they can be modified. Or these are the prom dresses, but they can be modified. And what you get is a very distinct understanding that no, a quince dress is specifically looks a certain way.
Yeah.
And as people start to put an emphasis on like, well, it's especially in the late 90s, early 2000s, like this is my youthful experience. And so like the post 2000 census where Latinos were seen as the fastest growing minority, that also meant they were a consumer demographic. So now we have a consumer demographic that's ethnicized or racialized, but it's also mixed with the idea of like youth cultural demographics, right? MTV, Nickelodeon, all these sorts of other booms around age specific marketing for kids and adolescents, right? Kind of fits in with, okay, Latinas, Latina girls playing a quince don't want to go to a quote unquote Latina bridal expo. And I was talking to one of these organizers at one point. He's like, I used to run bridal expos, and what you get were a lot of Latino families who hadn't celebrated before looking for dresses for quinceañeras, and he's like, the draw was so heavy. He's like, well, we might as well just have expos just for quinceañeras, and that was about the early 2000s, and it's only grown since then, right? And so you get this specialized niche market, and then now you have competition, right? So that means it's not just one style of dress, it's 100 style of dresses. Or it's not just like, oh, we can show you what Mary's Bridal has in a junior petite line. It's no, now we're going to look at the very specific quinceanera branded dresses that are saying this isn't a wedding dress, this isn't a prom dress. We can customize this for your event. And there was something about being seen. So that consumer experience really sort of grew and had a life of its own. It has a life of its own in terms of style, shape, color, and very much in terms of the number of dresses, right? Like any sort of luxury item, it isn't like you have one dress, you have three, you have costume changes. And so all that's not required. And it's not just like you do it once. Like, and again, depending on the size, depending on tax brackets, right? All of that changes. So now you have this variability on a variety of levels. But I can absolutely tell you, you can go into a shop or you can look in a catalog, and without having like the branding names, I feel like I can say what makes a quince dress versus a prom dress versus a wedding dress. And it's very, very distinct. And maybe that's because I've never seen a 3-piece convertible purple and silver zebra print wedding dress. That doesn't mean it's not coming, but it's a very specific kind of niche style for quinceañeras.
Well, maybe you can paint that for us. Like, how is a quince dress for those people who haven't seen one and don't know what that looks like? How is it different than a prom dress versus a wedding dress?
So a classic, let's say, what's seen as sort of the classic shape for a quince dress is a ball gown, right? So that large A-line skirt that's very full with a crinoline or some other kind of 3D bolstering underneath. There's all sorts of different kinds of traditional crinolines with like a hoop skirt, or sometimes it's just a pull-on slip that's got tulle in it. In Mexico, I came across these really interesting biodegradable, I think sort of single-use paper crinoline that again was a lot cheaper, but you're only going to use it once. So again, depending on your tax bracket, there are ways in which you can create volume. So a traditional quince dress really models like 17th century Spanish and French court dresses, which is tight corseted, which sort of accentuates the bust, off the shoulder, in some way open, and then with this very large skirting, right? And for quinces, right, this idea of full length gown sort of symbolized formality, but it was also because it was being coupled with a kind of traditional waltz. So young women, as part of the tradition, right, you appear in church and then you have a celebration. It's really a dinner dance, right? And so in this dinner dance scenario, young women are presented publicly, and part of that public presentation is a couples or a group dance with their court of honor, who aren't dressed the same, but are dressed to sort of accentuate the birthday girl. So traditional quince dresses, again, tend to be long. They tend to be a little bit more modest. So in terms of modesty, you still might be off the shoulder, but their chest is covered for the most part, or they have a high neck, or they have some kind of bolero jacket or a scarf, something where they're covering up a little. And over the course of an evening, a young woman might remove some of these extra bits. More and more you can find. So the ball gown is the most like traditional in style, right? A cinched waist, a wide petticoat, and really this reminiscent of European court culture, sort of classic princess style. Right, classic princess style ball gown. More and more, as young women are saying, I don't look good in that, or I don't like that. You can find different variations, but sort of the most popular dresses I saw were some variation of a ball gown that in the early 2000s, the mid 2000s, the regular ball gown became something that you could take apart. So it was a ball gown that had removable pieces. So your ball gown, although you come in and process in sort of this grand form, if you're going to dance with your friends all night, there's a mini skirt underneath that you take off and sort of literally convert, which I thought was really fun. A lot of sort of these. So there was that kind of like the dress changes shape, but it's roughly the same. But so the idea that something like colors and textures and applique becomes really important. So, what makes it your dress? And so I worked with a small dress shop in San Jose, California, which is where I was doing much of my dissertation field work. And they were very much like, we are not your chain bridal store. We are not Mary's Bridal. And you're like, cool, okay, what does that mean? Well, that means, our dresses really start at about $600. And with that, you can customize, right? So you go from a plain bodice and a plain skirt in a solid color, and then you add, right? And so at any different levels, so they would talk to me like, oh, this was around the time, this is the early 2000s, around the time when the Disney quinceanera dress lines just started coming out. So you can get a Cinderella inspired quinceanera style dress, right? You can get a Mulan inspired, you can see all these things.
Yeah.
And so this bridal shop was one of the earliest to be like, oh, we can give you your, Belle themed quinceanera, Beauty and the Beast, sort of like off branded, but exactly how you'd want it, right? What would you want it to look like? And so their big sticking point was customization. So that became a huge focus. Like, how do you make this your own? And this was important because the girls that I was speaking with and the families who were planning, that was really the drive. How do I find my dress? How do I plan my event? Not how is this a communication with other generations or other local communities. It became very personalized. And I feel like that's one of the biggest distinctions over the generations. And I feel like it's some of the most like, when you talk to different generations of folks, particularly in places like Texas, where you don't really need planners and people to be intervening, not like in other places where the generations don't go as deep either in their locality or in the tradition itself, where you have people saying, I need a planner, or I need to go somewhere, I need someone to tell me what to do for this event. And so then you have this narrative of the particular moment that sort of characterizes what their daughter or their niece or even their son might end up doing. But so this idea of, this customization, what the dresses look like, they're princess dresses, they really are. But they also, so sometimes you could see like, oh, I could see that as a wedding dress if it was in white or in ivory. But like in hot pink with like, with a pair of bedazzled sneakers, it's not a wedding gown, right? You could see it right away on the body. It's not a wedding gown, even though you could see, okay, I see where you would start, like coming with the same. And with prom dresses, and I was really interested. I would interview a lot of young women at home. They'd invite me to their kitchens and set out pictures and show me sort of their. I thought it was great. A lot of people told stories through the images, which is, I realized that was really important for people. So the dress became this larger symbol of the event itself and the way that they talked through it. But they would also ended up, if they were, in their early 20s usually, would show me pictures of their prom dresses and things like that. And I was like, oh, you could see right away there was a difference. And part of it was a volume. Like, maybe that's just the style and era, but for the most part, the silhouettes were not so full, right? There wasn't extra crinoline. In fact, most of them were fairly sleek, fairly narrow, hugging of the body. And they would say things like, oh, I wouldn't wear this to my quince. Like, it almost like it didn't have enough coverage. Even if you're being cinched in by a corset, you still have layers and layers of fabric. There's something about it that's not normal for a prom, but it's absolutely part of the quince to have this sort of physical presence where you're also not being expected to move around so freely, right? You're sort of maintaining a kind of, we'd say, regal posturing, right? And even sort of slow moving. You literally can't run so far. It was a little bit different sort of with the characterizations of kind of being with your high school friends at prom. It was very different feeling, right? Or the idea that you're needing to literally fit into space with other people. The quince dress is really about standing out. It's
Right.
about, and it's also, I always tell people, it's so interesting because you think about the size of the dresses, right? You think about the circumference, like the diameter of like a dress is a good 5.5 feet, right? So it's talking about sometimes very small bodies taking up quite a bit of space. And I found that really fascinating. That the evolution of the dresses are all about girls actively wanting to or sort of embodying taking up more space in society. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell us about the journey of how you wrote this book. You said did it start as a dissertation?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this book started as a dissertation. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I hope that doesn't interrupt. Yes, this book started as my dissertation. And since it took about, so I started doing field work for the Quince in 2009. So it was a good 10 years after that it finally was published. But it had a variety of iterations. And originally, when I was working on this for my dissertation, so I went to Indiana University and got my PhD in folklore. And I studied under Pravina Shukla, who was a body art scholar. And she worked on the sort of elaborate layers of Indian wedding dress. And so I learned a lot about dress in the body from a ritual kind of perspective. But what was really missing for me, and something that wasn't really part of my work in terms of my training, was sort of this understanding of intersectionality, or thinking about race and class and gender being performed through dress in a very explicit way. And so I did a lot of collecting. I decided that at first I thought, oh, I'll work in a quinceanera dress shop and just watch people shop, like, be around. And that was like, I didn't end up doing that because I ended up living somewhere else. But I noticed the places where I was living in the Bay Area, which is where I'm from, there were quinceanera shops everywhere. And I thought that was hilarious. For somebody in my mind, like, have they always been here? Did I miss this?
Yeah.
And so something about this sort of being in all these places, like it was somehow like, the rent here is not cheap. Like, this is an expensive place to have a business. Do you really have that much business? And they did, right? And so this, to me, I was like, there's something here I'm missing from this business angle. And so I started following Quinceañera expos. I found one because I was following a small business was saying, oh, you want to see what dresses we produce? Oh, well, I have a show. I was like, you have a show? Like, oh, we're going to be at an expo and we're going to be featuring our dresses. And I was like, I have no idea what that means, but thank you. I took, the information and I showed up. And I realized, there were, especially in the early 2000s, only a handful of companies around the nation that were the planners and providers of quinceanera expositions. And the one that I ended up working with was quinceanerasmagazine.com. And they were a national, franchise company that had these different sort of outposts. They're out of Las Vegas, but they were all over the West Coast, in the Midwest. In maybe the last 10 years, they've gotten to the East Coast, Washington, D.C. But the idea is they host quinceañera expos in these different places, and they kind of cater to the different communities. So I spent a good 2 years following them around the Southwest, particularly all up and down the California coast, and getting a sense for what they were doing from a business angle, but also really, I found them to be these really interesting indicators of some sort of cultural practice. As in, if there's going to be there's a quinceañera expo happening in what was then called like the Central Coast in California, like it was away from the big cities. You're like, there has to be, they're identifying and saying, we're not going to do this unless we think there is a market for this here. So part of it was saying, as I follow these expos to like Iowa and Nebraska and these places, I was like, they have enough of a population to make one of these expos worthwhile, to get vendors.
Wow.
And they did. And so I basically started saying like, okay, the quinceañera industry is sort of marking where there are growing or established Latino communities and vendors. So it was this combination of where Latinos are, and how following traditions, right, can sort of indicate
Mm-hmm.
like saying, you're in the right neighborhood with a certain kind of like taqueria or restaurant, right, food culture. Like you can, oh, I know where I am. And I found that quinceañera shops were part of that narrative. And to me, that was so important because when I think about Latino communities, I really do think heavily about patriarchy and masculinity, or masculine kind of domination. So the idea that a young woman's tradition um, could be such an important part of, let's say, a neighborhood economy or regional economy, I thought was fascinating. And so the political
Yeah.
economy of the event, thinking about the dress as it's, whether it's mass produced in China and brought in, through Houston and then distributed to some sort of chain, or whether people are selling. I found it really interesting because I found companies that were, exclusive in the US, but they were importing directly from Mexico or from Latin America. And that
Mm-hmm.
became like a really hot commodity. Because all of a sudden you could say, if you're a third generation Mexican American, that your dress came from Mexico, and somehow
Mm-hmm.
that was about the story that you wanted to tell about yourself or your family wanted
Yeah.
to tell about them. So that became super, super important to me, was sort of following the fabric, following, the price
Mm-hmm.
tags, and only seeing, even under COVID, only seeing the tradition and the business sector grow. And I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
fascinating, right? This idea of whether everything going more and more into growth, into kind of specificity, into sort of the obscurity of like, oh, this is a home-based tradition. This is something that, our family does quietly, maybe with our church, to, go online and check out the Disney Quinceañera packages. They start around $7,000 and go up from there, just to have your quinceañera at Disneyland. And again, with the demographics of Southern California or Florida, right? They're full, right?
Yeah.
And so you realize, and so for me, that became really powerful to think about entering a cultural community through a traditional practice and kind of get a sense for not just how communities see that tradition and see their life and history and stories, but then realize how much outsiders are saying, hey, this is something we should pay attention to. And so this growth of a consumer demographic of Latinos, again, being marketed towards specifically for like cultural practices, became really powerful to me, became really significant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you talk about the price tag. So what does that range look like?
So this, again, hugely varies. In the mid 2000s, early 2010s, a princess, quote unquote, princess quinceanera was about $30,000, right? And so that's this family budget. But you
Mm-hmm.
can have, again, that's probably including, multiple dresses and like a venue for 200 people, right? And people, and all
Mm-hmm.
being kind of maybe black tie.
And
But it
people
can
being
vary,
fed.
and people being fed, right? People being
Mm-hmm.
fed. And so part of this is, it used to be, right, a young woman would have a court of honor. So of some number of friends or cousins, usually family, right? They would
Mm-hmm.
invite, and everyone would learn this waltz together. One of the most interesting things I found was in the early 2000s and the early 2010s. One of the things that was picking up was all the audio visual marketing that was, so people getting videographers and professional everything to document their quinces. But at the same time, that also meant people like, well, we're going to invest in a videographer, that this dance better be good. So that meant hiring not like your friend or your niece to do the choreography, but someone professional. And that escalated to these like dance studios who said, well, we actually have 6 men, young men, who are dancers with us that we'll rent as part of your event. And so you see the sort of
Oh.
transformation. Part of the cost, I think, is also connected to the fact of how far photos and video would go, right? The idea, this is going to be online. We are going to post this on YouTube. Now it's going to be on TikTok, or it's going to be out there. So let's not embarrass ourselves and our family. So it opened up a whole new, budget part. We never paid their cousins, right? Everyone bought their own dress, and they didn't have that. That was the gift, was that they were part of it. But now you have these professional interventions that are really upping the price tag, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's a different sort of game in terms of where you're like, what kind of quince do you want? Do you want something themed? Do you want something at a particular location? And I think was really interesting, right? Who could afford to have This was actually most popular when I was. I remember very distinctly a dance company I was in San Diego at an expo, and these folks were young men from Tijuana, from right across the border, who were sort of like, oh yeah, we work with this group, and we can learn any dance, and they were probably between the ages of uh 16 and 21. And
Mhm.
the whole idea was they looked young. I couldn't tell. Put them in the colorful suits, and they all know their dance steps. So that kind of tradition of having these sort of professional chambelanes or professional dancers, again, connecting it to social media, like what you want to see, but it also meant you had a lot more people who were not choosing to have these courts of honor. The court of honor was very symbolic in terms of like the young girl's years, like it was traditionally, sometimes it was 7, sometimes it was 14, but it all kind of revolved around the girl and her escort being like the 15th person or couple. Um, and all of a sudden
Mhm.
that was kind of falling off to the wayside because like, well, we're having professional chambelanes, but they're just going to be dancing. They don't go to the church with you. And so a lot of young women were actually opting out of having courts of honor, but they
Mhm.
would also opt out sometimes of having other women. Sometimes it was just all men. Sometimes it was just all girls. But people were modifying that either based on
Mhm.
budgets or just based on, again, I think about what I actually heard a young woman say, like, I don't want any other girl in the picture. I want it to just be me. So it's
Wow.
her and 7 young men. And you're like,
Mhm.
okay, I guess. And part of this comes back to like, well, we're paying for professional photographs. This is what I want. This is the aesthetic I want. And I thought
Mhm.
for me, that was really powerful, right? One, this idea of the visual narrative that they're creating in the moment, but that they want to persist. And kind of the audacity. I'm like, man, I don't think I talked like that when I was 15. Like I didn't have any concept of that. But I believe that's connected to sort of this connection to their lives being rooted in social media for so much longer. The
Mhm.
idea that no, 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 this is going to be an outward facing event. This is
Mhm.
about how I look, what I can post, what my family will post, what is the most flattering, And so people are very, very cognizant of the social curation of the event.
Mhm.
Um, and so again, how people spend changes dramatically, right? Whether it's about limousines, whether it's about food, whether it's about professional dancers, all of that, venues, right? All of that kind of compounds to where you can get very, very large scale events.
So tell me, I'm really curious about these group dances. Are they
Yeah,
like stuffy, or are they like
yeah,
doing like super choreography to like hip hop, or like
yeah.
what what do they
I
look
tell
like? Or
you, all of the above. So traditional. Okay, so we think about quinceañeras. The roots very much are cultural practices of European court culture, right? So
Mhm.
you have the idea, if you think about any good Jane Austen period piece movie, right? And you have couples dancing in unison, kind of slow. That classic waltz has always been part of the quinceañera, and you can think of it even if you're connected right in the South, thinking about cotillions, right? Teaching young men and young girls and boys to be young women and young men, right? Gentility, and part of that is the couples dance.
Yeah.
And so for quinces, it's always been a group couples dance. So the young woman and her escort, and then 7 other girls and their escorts, and um, what people see sort of on the performance event itself, the day of, right, the party, is couples dancing, very basically, um, learning a court waltz. They're in unison. They're very practiced and dignified for the most
Mhm.
part. And the social background behind that is this for a lot of these. Traditionally, this is a lot of these kids' first time in that co-ed situation,
Yeah.
right? This idea of a young, like a 13 or 14-year-old slow dancing with another 13 or 14-year-old opposite sex it's usually kind of the first moment. So it's sort of
Mhm.
symbolizing the sort of transition into you're growing into these sort of new relationships potentially. Nobody wants anything to happen, but here's a practice session. You want to see what it's like to sort of be in that kind of pseudo that social proximity. Will give it to you. And so it's supposed to be this symbolic, and it is usually kind of stuffy, right? But in the last 25 years, what you've got is, okay, I'll do the stuffy dance, but I also want to do another dance. And so they
Mhm.
enter the baile de sorpresa, the surprise dance. And so you have what everyone expects to see, which is the court waltz, right? A classic song that people recognize, the pace and things. And then you have a costume change. And sometimes it's more elaborate, like it's a full costume change, or sometimes, the young men take off their jackets, but the young women are come back out in like jean shorts and white tank tops, and then they do whatever they want to do. And again, a lot of times this is where the most effort has been placed, right, on figuring out my surprise dance, because everyone expects the court waltz as sort of that's a piece of the structural tradition. But the surprise dance, which no one's really surprised at, it's not really, now they just call it a surprise dance, but they know it's coming, right?
Yeah.
Is hip hop, it's reggaeton, is whatever you want it to be. It's a lot of this is really interesting because it really comes to reflect the young woman and her family and what they want or what she wants, right? So I've seen girls who are not sort of affiliated with like Catholic or any kind of Christian sort of religious tradition, but they're more indigenously minded. And so they do like ballet folklorico or danza azteca, something to reflect that aspect of their identity. And there are people that love to dance and they're like, oh, I want to do sort of like the Mexican norteño cowboy routine. And they do, right? It's not uncommon. I see, girls all over Texas in their cowboy boots with their quince dresses, right? That is very regional. Yeah. And so the dances come to reflect like who's popular. I can only imagine how many times a young girl has choreographed with her and her friends around like a Beyonce song or like, whoever's popular at the moment, to see what's going on. So those end up being the surprise dances. And I always think that's when, aunts and grandmothers get a little bit angry, right? Why are they moving like that? Why are they dressing like that? But it almost gives them an outlet for that kind of criticism because across the board, it is a lot more open and it is a lot more, the traditions have been a lot more welcoming of the girls saying, no, that's not for me. Whether it's I'm going to wear pants or whether it's I'm going to wear red, right? This idea of the capacity to say you can be part of this conversation. We want you to have this as part of your story, but on your terms. And so, I feel like on a lot of levels, that's what people are paying for, this opportunity to express themselves in this really public way.
That's so fun. I'm not a dancer, but I love seeing group dances, and I wish that was part of our culture more. Like, I wish that like we all just like learn these group dances and we could just like break out and dance like in musicals. That would be my dream.
I feel like the high school musical, like everyone just kind of like, that's the fantasy, like we're all, but you realize if you think about it, right, it's sort of it's joyous, right? Thinking a lot about the politics of being joyful, right? Celebrating. And also the idea that for, reality check, culturally and socially, when I was talking to families, what really came, because people talk about the cost or if it's sexual or, just this idea of high criticism. And what you really got was that families were like, this isn't about telling her she's old enough to have children or get married. This is telling her, enjoy your youth while you still have it. And so the idea that's like, oh, everything's different. Well, sort of. Everything is changed. But really, it's, for the most part, it's about saying you have a little more responsibility, but you're still a kid. So you go from your glam and your hair extensions and your full makeup and the stiletto heels, which God knows how you walked in, to your sneakers and your jeans and going back to your first year of high school or maybe your second year, depending on your age. And so there's this, one of the things that so the two things, right? This idea of this development of joy and this kind of appreciation that their daughters matter and their happiness matters. And I talk to families who are like, she'll get married or she won't. She'll go to college, she'll have a future, but we want her to know that she's loved and valued now. And to me, growing up in a Latino family, like that's huge. That's not something that we get all the time, but it was also a lot of mothers who were working very hard and who never had the luxury of even being able to think about having one of these celebrations. Kind of doubling down on understanding that successful people, particularly in the United States, successful people have good childhoods. And so the idea was thinking about, I want my daughter to have good memories of her youth because somehow that precedes everything else she might be able to do later. And I was like, that's deep. That's powerful. like, okay. And you knew it was coming from a place almost of hurt, like the idea of how much they struggled in their own lives. And so they're saying, be young. You don't have to work now. Like, again, for most, you don't have to work. You don't have to hustle. You can go be 14, 15, enjoy yourself, go to high school, imagine the stages. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that people are really dreaming through, right? So one of the first things in this book is, thinking about quinceañeras are about potential. And that's something that people don't really understand. I've gotten a lot of, over the years, lots of inquiries about, like, don't you think these families spend too much money? Or don't you think these families should learn how to spend, learn how to like budget? I was like, first of all, that is not my priority in any way to tell people how to spend their money. But at the same time, I think it was this idea of not being able to understand the value structure that people were coming from or what they hope to build with sort of their families in the US as different from what they came from. And so I think it's really significant because I think the quinceañeras in the United States, one, because they're pan-Latino, like they although the traditions that they follow tend to be those that came from Mexico proper, because it's Mexican Americans, Cuban Americans, Dominicans, Nicaraguans, whoever's in the US, right, gets sort of that blanket umbrella term, that it creates a different kind of pan-Latino community who are celebrating, right? And so there's a different kind of community building as a part of that. But it's also realizing that the tradition as it exists, like in the continental United States, or even as people move across borders and go back and forth, whether it's buying things or celebrating in different places, is that it couldn't exist anywhere except in the United States. All of this, it's really, to me, it's a US American tradition because you have influence from the diaspora of people like, oh, I have cousins in Mexico. I know what the styles are there. Or maybe a fashion designer saying, oh yeah, I was doing work in Guatemala, so the fabrics, I can tell you what they're using there. But it's still happening in Vegas or Seattle or Nebraska, somewhere Omaha. And so there's something about that that I think is really powerful. And with that connection with like social media, because that really was the heart of the time period where you think about the slice of research that I'm doing, right? It was tiny, right? It was this very particular moment where you had these this new moment of these consumer exhibitions, expositions, but you also absolutely had sort of social media was the center of people's lives, particularly Facebook at the time for youth still. Facebook was a huge piece of people's lives that everything was about producing and Facebook and YouTube. And so I would talk to young girls who were like, well, how are you going to pick your dress? So they go on Google and but like, quinceañera dresses. What do quinceañera dresses look like? Or quinceañera dresses by color. Or they'd go on YouTube and they would see someone's promotional video that someone's videographer put up, and then they'd be inspired by that. And so the idea of possibilities, to me, wholly were accomplished by the imaginations of young women, either on their bodies or what they chose and created that got put together and then circulated. And that becomes the potential like inspiration for another generation. So all of a sudden it's like, yes, we have to understand there is a consumer marketplace. Yes, it could exist without all of that, but together it produces something unique. And on some level, it really does cater to that like young teenage Latina girl saying, it's me picking things and then creating a legacy for the next generation to keep or reject, really, or to build from. So I think that's powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's step back for a minute and talk about the quinceañera's history, like how it even started, where it started, and the evolution to how it got to today.
Yeah. That's both an easy question and a hard question. It's an easy question because it's actually very, I think it's very simple in many ways. But so here's the thing, the way the quinceañera, there's the idea of what can you actually prove? What can you actually curate and say, oh, here's the breadcrumbs that say this is the historical arc. And there's that versus the stories people tell. And I think they're equally important. So when I talk to people, when I was interviewing people and having our conversations about dresses or photos or food or anything, to do with the celebration, and I ask people, oh, do you know where the tradition comes from? Like, And they would often say it came from like the Aztecs. And you realize that like, okay, think about like, I'm like, how deep are we going here? What are we thinking about? But, somewhere along the line, and this is true, with actually thinking about some of the bias in scholarship, which was sort of Chicana, Mexican American sort of scholars and artists talking about the history of coming of age rituals in different indigenous tribal communities in Latin America, which some like the Aztecs and the Maya, right, and the other sort of kingdoms that were prominent in different periods of the pre-Columbian times, right? Yes, coming of age rituals were important. Young women and young men were separated out at different times. And for the Aztecs in particular, because the documentation is so clear, the young Aztec girls around 13 or so were either sort of tracked for domestic life or educated life, which was more like a priestly class, right? Were you going to be were you going to be helping priests in a temple, or were you going to be learning to do household work and be a mother or a family? And so people sort of interpreted and ran with that. They're like, oh, this is sort of where this idea is coming from. And you can see that clearly it's got a life. It must have a life in Mexico, and it must have all these things. And it eventually sort of migrated with people. There's not a whole lot of evidence about sort of that direct connection. But when you're looking at sort of the earliest documented instances of something that looks like a quinceañera in what we say is a quinceañera now, you're thinking about the 1910s, 1920s in Texas and in northern Mexico. And we're thinking a lot about post-revolutionary Mexico. So we're thinking a lot about, and so this is where I'll tell you what I've developed as my idea of sort of the tradition developing. Because again, I don't discount sort of this connection to people having memory and passion for indigenous roots that would include rituals, but the quinceañera itself isn't something you would have found in pre-Columbian Latin America. It's just, because if you look at the quinceañera itself, right, it is literally court rituals from Europe. So whatever it is, it's post-contact in what it's produced, right? The dresses, the waltzes, all of those things are European court customs, but it's absolutely a blend, right? Nothing, it's all blended, but how that blending came together is a little more confusing or a little less clear. So I think it's in my introduction. We'll see. I'm pretty sure. Thinking a little bit about sort of those origins, for me, it was super important to sort of say, well, there's where people think it comes from. And that's powerful because you realize that's the narrative that they're bringing intimately to what they're doing, right? I want to be close to those roots. And so understanding, okay, so what is that about? But the earliest sort of recorded quinces, sort of the quinceañeras, again, were the early 20th century. Early decades of the 20th century, really post-Mexican Revolution. And at this point in time, what you have are wealthy and middle-class Mexicans, right, moving north into the United States. You had a lot of people crossing borders and starting again with government upheaval. Folks weren't able to keep their businesses, or they weren't able to raise their families the way they wanted, and so they're moving, right? This early sort of diaspora, but they're still remaining very much being labeled Spanish or Mexican, right? We're talking about being in the borderlands in the American Southwest. And what we find, again, is culture and transformation, right? So what was very popular, and this is via a book called From Out of the Shadows, which is this famed Mexican-American historian, Vicky Ruiz, who writes all about women and women in the archive and what is missing, and thinking about, what were women doing at this time when they didn't have such a public record of their lives. And there's this wonderful piece she writes about called Starstruck. And it's all about young, particularly Mexican-American or quote-unquote Spanish women being sort of enamored with Hollywood glamour and Hollywood magazines and movies, and thinking a little bit about wanting to be part of sort of this glamorous American pop culture scene, going to the movies, going to shops, buying makeup, but living under the cultural strictures of conservative and strict Mexican families, right? Parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, they were still very much from Mexico with the culture of sort of that upper class conservatism. And they were probably young teenagers, or they came to the US and they were younger. And so she spoke of at this time period, young women were saying, well, I would like to go out and get a job. It was becoming more and more normalized. But this idea of being out alone, there was still a lot of questions about honor and shame and what are you doing? And so even if young women worked, it was often that young women worked outside the home, came home, and gave their check to their parents, their father. And she spoke of sort of the dislike of like, I want to live, I'm making money so I can buy the things I want and I'm not able to. And so she was saying so it was like the early 1930s, that young women were at 14, it was legal to run off and get married. And this is what girls were doing more than anything, was to trying to gain freedom from these strict families in this new cultural environment that said, there's other ways people are being, there's other ways of socializing, there's other ways to live your life. And I think when I think of the sort of that moment where 14 was this moment to say, I'd rather be away and moved out of my family and working and doing what I want with my money than staying under these strict rules, these strict households. And that was a problem for families. And I feel like the quinceañera really developed as a kind of compromise. Like, look, we'll have a wedding-like celebration. We will have a ritual acknowledging your coming of age. We're going to mark you as a growing young woman, but you still live in our household. You'll have some freedom, but you're not an adult yet. And what you get is something that also mirrors, because the idea with this idea of getting married and leaving, that was not typical of Mexican culture. So part of this was also about retaining upper class Mexicanness in the United States at a time when people were saying, we moved here, but we still want to be Mexican. We left because we had to, because things were crumbling. So what you have is this courtly waltz, this really upper class sense of a dinner and a ball and respectable partners and no touching, all very sort of controlled and elegant. And that's meant to be sort of your entry into the society that we want you to engage with and talk to, but we'll also offer you a little bit of freedom by publicly acknowledging that we see you as growing up. And so in many ways, all the tie back to European court customs is really thinking about the upper class culture of Mexico and its connection to European court customs, particularly under the reign of Maximilian and Carlotta, sort of that period of Mexico being run by, French aristocracy, right? So there's this whole callback that's very specifically about upper class Mexicanness. And then once that tradition, it sort of develops as again, but then it, like with any folklore, right? Once it's out, it's out. And then it can grow, change, and shift. But so the idea of the history of itself, I think, is super muddled. It's really thinking about what people have made of it. But in actuality, you didn't see quinceañeras as you see them now, or even in their sort of more classic, like a dinner and a dance or a family dinner, until the early 20th century. So even though there's this rooting of ritual coming of age, there's, ritual coming of age celebrations across the globe, right? They're not all leading towards the quince. It just happens to be the social and political circumstances of, I think, of greater Mexico that made the quince what it is in the United States today.
But unlike coming out in like English society, there is a religious aspect to the quinceañera. Is that right?
There is. The religious aspect, again, with this idea of respectability politics and upper class culture in Latin America, that was always associated with the Catholic Church. When in fact, in the hemispheric Americas, the Catholic Church didn't actually acknowledge the quinceañera as what they call a sacramental until about 2008.
Wow.
So the Catholic Church, it's always been like a handshake deal. It's like, this is something our Hispanic Catholics do. But at any point, Catholic priests at different parishes could say no. And they did. When I was in the Midwest, I would talk to young women who lived in small town Midwest, who maybe were part of the only Latino family. And it's like, oh, we couldn't have a quince because the priest said it wasn't something he knew how to do, or they didn't want to do it. They didn't like it. So without a sort of critical mass of Latino Catholics, it wasn't something that necessarily would get done. But what I thought was really interesting was families who were really, really invested in wanting their daughter to have the celebration would leave the church, would go find another sort of community And this is where I noticed, and I was really interested, right? Because I didn't really think about the religious aspect as much. Um, the idea that there was a lot of Protestant quinceas. And they were, I was like, how can you have a Protestant quinceañera? And if you think about it, because it was never really officially about the church, it's really about the people. And so if the Protestant church was willing to allow families to learn and celebrate, we think about the quinceañera as having this blessing component, right? And in the Catholic Church, it's called a misa de gracias, like a Thanksgiving mass. They're giving thanks for this young woman, and it's a reaffirmation of a young woman's baptismal promises. What you're thinking, the questions they ask are literally about denying the devil and staying pure. And I actually talked with young women who said, when they told me when I renounced the devil and I said no, they just kept going. Like people that have sort of like didn't really believe in the church aspect of it, but were like, my parents or someone wants me to do this.
Yeah.
But they sort of laughed at like being able to sort of pick at some of those traditional elements that they didn't believe in. But again, the compromise of the celebration. So I met lots of young women who had blessings from a pastor or a non-denominational reverend or someone come in that wasn't a full mass, right? That maybe was done at their home, that had just had a different tenor to it, but the function was the same. And what it came down to was, we're grateful you're alive, we're grateful you're here, and we have nothing but hope for your future. And that's really what it came down to. It didn't necessarily have to come down to maintaining virginity, or maintaining, because for the Catholic celebration, I thought is really interesting to me is, for Catholics in the Quinceañera celebration, even before it was official, right? It was always about leaving fresh flowers for the Virgen de Guadalupe. It was always part of this celebration, honoring Christ's mother. And I wrote a paper, probably in grad school somewhere, about the, how hard is it for young women to live up to, virgin motherhood? Like that's, thinking, because one of the ideas that always comes up with the conflict with religious ideas is, well, your people are condoning young women to have sex. Like, no, we're not. The idea goes, the church is very heavily invested in using quinceañeras as teaching moments, moments from which where Catholicism and the values of Catholicism can be front and center. And honestly, for the most part, it's not the case in terms of families. And a lot of times families come back to the church so they can have the quince in the church. And I laugh. I talked to a variety of churches, old, beautiful churches that were sort of up in arms about how often, like, they're like, we're booked for months. We're booked for 6 months because people want to have photos in with their beautiful antique chandeliers. And you're like, okay, like, part of me is like, what do you want me to say? Like, people know what they want, but it's also, it at one point it was more popular in cohorts, groups. Um, I never saw that really happening, but I know in Texas, where the tradition goes deeper, you might have multiple quinceañeras celebrating together. And
Oh,
so and that is not
share the
something that
costs.
share the cost. Now it's about $1,500 for the church. $1,500 for your Saturday afternoon at the
Oh,
church, and that's for
yeah.
family. So
Yeah.
the way that I think about um, the Catholic Church in particular is that in 2008, so that's really late in the game, 2008, when the church was saying, oh, we've officially released a mass for quinceañera that's official, that all priests can use, right? All of a sudden, it kind of became a conversation about um, about audience, and saying the Hispanic church is losing Catholics, losing Latino Catholics. And
Yeah.
so this idea of like, oh no, we're on the same team, or we're working together. Um, and so for me, the church was another sort of marketing entity, right? To tell you what to wear, what not to wear, how to celebrate. And people had other people doing that as well. So it was another competing voice. And so I don't do, and I think most of the work that's been done about quinceañeras has worked with churches specifically. But part of me was saying, the church, and I was like, I'm just going to come at it from a different angle. The church narrative wasn't necessarily the one that I wanted, but also after finding that it wasn't even one that existed in a kind of solid practice, to me almost felt disrespectful I was like,
Mm.
Hispanic Catholics have been your bread and butter for millennia, and they couldn't even get something in writing until the early 2000s. And
Yeah.
people were devout, right? So I think that it's an interesting symbol of like, oh, wait, we need to respond to this community, right? Because we're losing.
Mm-hmm.
But so yeah, so the church has played a huge role and I think continues to play a role, but it's competing. It's competing
Yeah.
with Disney and it's competing with custom dressmakers and it's competing with Danza Azteca and other ritual celebrations. So the church doesn't really have, and it's competing with other faith communities to say, hey, we like that too. We will bless your daughter
Yeah.
if you're in our community. So this idea that the community's demand for both attention and acknowledgement, right, as consumers, but also as faith-based consumers, right, I think is saying something about communities changing and growing.
Mm. So, what about the boys in the
Yeah.
Latino communities? Do they have any sort of equivalent celebration?
Of their own, no, like not specifically. So here's the
Okay.
thing. So one in the last, again, maybe the last 10 years, seeing young men having quinces is more and more popular.
Mm.
Um, Often they're upper class, they're people with money,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's a coming out, it's a display of gratitude. People are like, oh, it doesn't just have to be for girls. It doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the values that's always been stuck, the gendered values that have been sort of the silent part of particularly Mexican American sort of machista family values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Patriarchal family values is that this idea that a woman has these external markers that have to be met before she can be seen as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas men aren't, men don't need to have that to have freedom. And so the
Mm-hmm.
idea is men don't need a quinta celebration to shave or to buy the sneakers they want or to go out with their friends. They can do that anyway. If
Mm-hmm.
anything, it's sort of the opposite where young men are perceived to have the freedom, but they also don't have the responsibility until they've already left home. And they don't need to leave home until they get married.
Mm-hmm.
For women, so marriage is a sort of symbolize different things, right? That idea of young women saying, I'm going to get married, I'm going to be out of here. I might be connected to
Mm-hmm.
another man, but at least I'll be away from sort of my natal household. And for
Mm-hmm.
young men, the pattern was he's going to stay at home as long as possible, where his mother will cook for him and wash his underwear until someone else is going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so so now, yes, you have people doing more quinceañeros or sort of modifying it. That's for, I would say, for people, wealthy folks or people who communities are just more open. You also have
Mm-hmm.
a trend where you might have queer kids who either
Mm-hmm.
they're queer young men or women, right, in different sort of states of gender presentation that might find it appealing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's a full on like I'm going to come out in a dress as my first sort of moment of being trans feminine or trans masculine, these different ways. Um,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but again, it's more open now. But in terms of actual, I would say the actual markers of, I still feel like the quinceanera serves as a marker for young men in the community. Because I had this great story from one young man who told me, he's like, man, I knew when I came of age because I, I'm
It's an Amber Alert.
sorry, I'm so sorry. Um, that they knew they came of age because someone asked them to sponsor the cake. And they had always been an escort. They had always
Mm-hmm.
been like, and that was like, it was like, because they were saying, oh yeah, my cousin wanted me to participate. He was all ready to be like his suit and dance. Like, oh no, no, for money, for the cake, because you're now too old. You've aged out of that role. And so to me, I was like, there you go. It's sort of understanding where your responsibility in the community lies. You are now seen as an adult, so it's financial resources, not necessarily your body in person, your skills dancing, because that doesn't work anymore. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of ways in which the tradition itself exposes these little cracks in perceptions of,
Mm-hmm.
oh no, no. You see yourself as a kid, but we see you as someone who works and lives on your own and should really be giving us money for it, to support the celebration, but you yourself are no longer young enough to be sort of part of the ritual. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think there's lots of ways that the ritual tells these different stories and sort of offers opportunities, right, to sort of understand the community story, but on the terms of the community. And that's always been sort of my favorite thing about folklore is telling students like this is about learning how communities communicate.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about, cake, how does cake communicate, right? Well, who's paying for it? How do we understand that to fit into the ceremony, as opposed to a different role?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our
Yeah.
conversation, but what do you feel is the overarching message of your book? What do you feel like you wanted people to take from your book?
So there's a few things. One is that for me, thinking about creativity as not only in the wheelhouse of the formally educated or the wealthy, right? Creativity, anyone can be creative. And the quinceañera traditions to me, no matter how much people talk about investing money or that it's a consumer exercise, to me, it's this beautiful creative combination of
Mm-hmm.
ages and generations and knowledge and change that we need to, that I respect and that I think continues to tell a community story from a community perspective. The
Mm-hmm.
second bit of that is about value and thinking about stories of mothers and daughters and grandmothers and fathers too, but mostly women saying, I didn't feel valued as a young woman, and I want my daughter to know what that feels like unconditionally. So it isn't about whether she goes to college or whether she gets married. It's telling her that she can be 15 and just some kid teenager, and we love her and we value her and we see her future as undeniably open, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was consistent, right? This idea of how proud these mothers were. And all I could think about in my head was my dad saying, like, what have they done? And the fact they didn't have to do anything, right? For this sort of pride and thinking about how that fits into family histories and community narratives and how that changes, right? How some
Mm-hmm.
people can feel about themselves. The third
Mm-hmm.
thing is actually where I leave off in the book at the end, which is thinking about this idea of desire. And to me, the quince creates a space for which young girls can have a preference for something and then can say, I have a preference. They can say, I want something and I don't want something. I want it and this is why. And actually have this ability to negotiate and say, but I like pink or I like purple or I
Mm-hmm.
like the shape of this or I absolutely don't want roast beef. I want tacos, right? This ability to just practice communicating your preferences as someone who grew up in a very strict conservative household,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't learn how to say what you want, you'll just accept anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, where my book ends is thinking about the politics of desire and how idealized women, in from a Catholic sort of cultural perspective, the idealized woman wants nothing. All she does is give and sacrifice. And
Mm-hmm.
so, what does it mean to say to our young women, it's okay to want things? It's okay to want to be seen. It's okay to want to be beautiful. It's okay. That's not all of you, but it can be part of you. And that really changes people's sense of how much they're allowed to value themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is, I think, one of the biggest aspects that where I learned from the quince and thinking about what that means. It's like, oh my God, for you to be able to say, I want this or I don't want this. And then in this particular event in their life, having that mean something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll get the pink stretched Hummer if that's what you want for this event, right? And seeing those choices manifest into something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, watching girls, break out into tears because they're thanking their parents for, this event and everything, and realizing that those moments of gratitude and so watching all that kind of happen and transpire was good for everybody. Was
Mm-hmm.
good for the family. But I think that idea of being able to say, I have the right to want things and
Mm-hmm.
that's okay. That's part of my life is one of the biggest tools that follows these generations of girls for years into the future.
I really love that. That is not something that that had even crossed my mind about these celebrations, but I think that
Yeah,
is so important. I mean, even as someone past that age period, I
yeah,
still think I'm a mom, and so I'm surrounded by a lot of moms all the time. But it's sometimes still difficult to
mhm,
ask for what I want and
yeah,
what I need, and
right,
I think that that is so important to to express to girls that it is important to say
yeah.
what you need and what you want. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as a mom myself, was writing with my little boy. he's only 9 now. But that idea of saying, like, what do we pass forward, right? That idea of saying you can say what you want. You don't
Yeah.
always get it.
Right.
But to be able, but to not have the skill of expressing it, right? Waiting till you're, I don't know, 35 and divorced. That's me.
Yeah.
To express what that is, like, you could save yourself a lot of heartache. I could save you a lot of hurt just by saying you have a choice and you can assert your choice. So to me, that's been the most powerful
Yeah.
element of hearing these stories and writing about the quince.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything that we've missed? Anything that we haven't covered that was an important?
No, I think this was great. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the conversation.
Oh, well, and it took so many different turns that I did not expect and was so beautiful. And you were writing in the, I didn't read the entire book, but the parts that I read, there were so many quotes that were just really beautifully written. So I encourage anyone who has an interest in this, I will put the link up on our website because it was really beautifully written, and it's written for the larger audience, right? It's written for popular culture. So it's not just an academic book.
It's not just an academic book.
Yeah. So we will thank you so much for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.
And for those listeners, I'm going to put the link up on our website, which is www.fabricoffolklore.com. And we thank you so much, folksy folks, for joining us on this quinceañera journey. And we want to hear from you. If you are from the Latino community, did you have one of these quinceañera celebrations, and what did you experience? Or did you not have one and you wish you did, or you provided one for your child? We want to continue this conversation, and you can do that by commenting, either if you're watching on YouTube or if you follow us on our Facebook group page. We pose these conversation starters so that people can have these conversations, because I don't want this podcast just to be out there for people to still listen to. I want it to be an interactive experience for people to continue these important conversations. So we are on Facebook. We have a page and a group. We're also on Instagram and sometimes on Twitter, X, and on LinkedIn. So you sparsely on those social media. So you can find us there. And if you were enjoying the show, I highly suggest that you subscribe and like, comment, and share it with your bestie. If you want to see us grow, sharing it with your friends and family is so incredibly helpful. And until next time, keep the focus.